The air in Sector 7 of the research station always held the precise scent of aged paper and dormant machinery, a comforting blend that spoke of forgotten histories and preserved knowledge. Blake thrived in this environment. Each shelf, every labeled container, every item meticulously catalogued and stored, represented a triumph of order over the entropy of time. Their workstation, a broad expanse of polished synthetic material, was a testament to their fastidious nature, data slate perfectly aligned, archival gloves folded with geometric precision, a single, unblemished mug of lukewarm nutrient paste positioned to the left of the monitor. Blake's current task involved the recategorization of the pre-collapse digital media collection, a vast array of obsolete storage devices. It was a monotonous, yet deeply satisfying process of verifying physical integrity against digital records, ensuring each entry in the station's central database accurately reflected its tangible counterpart. They worked with a quiet intensity, fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the dusty surfaces of ancient data tapes and crystalline shards. The rhythmic click of the scanner was the only sound in the cavernous space, a steady pulse in the quiet hum of the station's distant ventilation system. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting angle of the overhead lights. Blake pulled a heavy, sealed container from a high shelf, that unknown media unverified designation on its label, a rare and unwelcome deviation from the norm. Such an oversight was an anomaly in itself, a loose thread in the meticulously woven fabric of the archive. Blake felt a familiar prickle of irritation. Every item in the research station was supposed to have a verified record, a traceable origin. They placed the container on the workstation, its dull gray surface coated in a fine layer of dust that suggested decades of undisturbed slumber. The seal, a series of complex latches, yielded with a series of soft, metallic clicks. Inside, nestled amongst layers of preserved foam, was not a collection of digital media, but a single object. It was a cube, roughly the size of Blake's fist. Its surface was a uniform, deep obsidian, absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. No seams were visible, no markings, no texture that Blake could discern through their archival gloves. It felt impossibly heavy for its size, a dense, inert mass that seemed to defy the natural properties of any known material. Blake rotated it slowly, their brow furrowing. It was entirely alien to the collection, to the entire station's inventory. No record of its existence flashed across their data slate. Blake checked the container's identification again. Unknown media, unverified. The label was accurate, but the contents were an outright contradiction. This wasn't media. It was something else. They felt a subtle but distinct shift in the air, a minute pressure against their eardrums, as if the atmospheric pressure in the room had suddenly changed. The sensation passed quickly, leaving only a faint ringing that Blake dismissed as a trick of the quiet. A flicker of unease, cold and sharp, traced its way up Blake's spine. This was more than a simple misfiling. This was an object that had no business being here, no logical place in the vast, ordered system Blake had dedicated their professional life to maintaining. They removed their gloves, the smooth, cool surface of the cube a stark contrast against their bare palm. It radiated no heat, no discernible energy, yet a strange, almost imperceptible tremor ran through it, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within Blake's own bones. They spent the next hour attempting to identify the material, to find any reference in the station's comprehensive databases. Nothing. The cube registered as an absolute void against the spectroscopic scanner, offering no data, no composition, no known elements. It simply existed, a perfect, impenetrable enigma.
The anomaly was no longer a minor irritation, it was a silent, insistent disruption.
The familiar hum of the ventilation system seemed to waver, dipping in and out of audibility. The cube pulsed in their hand, or perhaps it was their own pulse, mirroring an imagined rhythm from the obsidian object.
Blake held it up, scrutinizing its depthless surface.
For a fleeting instant, the faint, shimmering reflection of the overhead lights seemed to stretch and distort, as if the very fabric of the air between their eyes and the cube was warping.
They blinked, and the distortion vanished, leaving only the dull, featureless black.
This object was not merely unidentified, it was fundamentally unidentifiable. It violated every principle of archival science, every law of material physics Blake understood. Blake worked in the hushed glow of their personal console, the only sound the low thrum of the research station's ventilation system and the occasional click of a digital page turning. The artifact, a palm-sized object of obsidian-like material, rested on a sterile examination mat. It wasn't truly obsidian, its surface absorbed light in a way that defied typical mineral properties, appearing less like a solid and more like a tear in reality, a patch of absolute void. Blake had retrieved it from a sealed, unlabeled container deep within Sector 7, a relic that had somehow escaped the rigorous cataloging system. They had spent the better part of 2 days running preliminary scans. Spectral analysis returned null readings, X-rays passed through it as if it weren't there, yet it possessed a tangible weight and a cool, almost damp feel against Blake's gloved fingers. This defied every principle of physics Blake understood. They meticulously documented each failed test, each anomalous result, their determination hardening into a brittle resolve. This wasn't merely an uncatalogued item, it was a fundamental incongruity. As Blake cross-referenced historical archives for similar material descriptions, a pattern, faint yet persistent, began to emerge. Scattered references in obscure anthropological reports, some dating back centuries, spoke of void stones or shadow anchors, objects said to warp perception, to draw the eye into impossible depths. Most entries were dismissed as folklore or misinterpretations of natural phenomena, tucked away in the station's deepest digital catacombs. But the descriptions, however archaic, resonated with the artifact's unsettling visual properties. The air in the console room, usually so predictable, seemed to thicken. Blake dismissed it as fatigue, rubbing their temples. They had not left Sector 7 in nearly 36 hours, subsisting on nutrient pastes and synthetic coffee. The artifact, for all its inertness, demanded their complete attention, pulling at their thoughts like a subtle, constant current. Hours bled into each other. Blake found themselves staring at the artifact, not through the lens of a microscope, but directly, their gaze drawn into its light-devouring surface. The obsidian-like material seemed to shift, not physically, but in the way one's peripheral vision might play tricks. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer. A suggestion of movement within its depths. Blake blinked, shaking their head. Just exhaustion. Then came the sound. A low, resonant hum that seemed to originate not from the research station's machinery, but from within their own skull. It vibrated against their eardrums, a deep, sustained tone that felt both ancient and utterly alien. Blake pulled their headphones off, listening intently. The hum persisted. They stood, walking to the console room door, pressing their ear against the cold metal. Nothing. Inside, the hum was undeniable, a subtle pressure behind their eyes. They returned to the artifact, a growing unease solidifying in their gut.
Was it the object? Or was it themselves?
Blake had always prided themselves on their meticulous nature, their logical approach. To doubt their own senses was to undermine the very foundation of their work. They reached for a comms unit, intending to contact a colleague. Perhaps the senior archivist, to describe the anomaly, to seek a second opinion. Their finger hovered over the call button. What would they say? "I've found an object that doesn't exist, and now my brain is humming?" The words felt absurd, unstable.
A colleague, the pragmatic engineer, would likely recommend a rest, a stress leave. They would not understand. They could not understand. A profound sense of isolation settled over Blake.
This was their discovery, their burden. The artifact had chosen them, or so it felt, for this impossible revelation. The hum intensified, a faint tremor running through the floor beneath their feet, or perhaps, within their own bones. The edges of their vision seemed to blur, the sterile white walls of the console room momentarily acquiring a faint, almost translucent quality, as if the very fabric of the research station were thinning. Blake gripped the edge of the console, their knuckles white. The artifact, on its mat, seemed to pulse with that internal, unheard thrum, a silent, ravenous presence. Blake's determination had solidified into an unyielding resolve. They had spent the last cycle pushing the artifact to its limits, feeding it carefully calibrated energy pulses from the research station's auxiliary conduit. The obsidian-like object, still resting on the sterile mat, had absorbed every input without visible change, yet Blake felt a growing resonance, a subtle hum not in the air, but behind their own eyes. The low thrum of the ventilation system, usually a comforting drone, now seemed to carry an unseen tension, a note stretched too thin. They adjusted the final parameters on the console, a sequence of complex oscillatory frequencies designed to mimic ancient vibrational patterns extracted from the artifact's latent energy signature. This was the final step, a gamble based on a fractured hypothesis. As Blake initiated the sequence, a wave of pressure, cold and pervasive, seemed to ripple through the very air. It wasn't a sound, but a tactile sensation, like being submerged in an invisible current. The artifact remained inert, its surface absorbing the light without reflection. But the environment around it began to subtly shift. The precise, angular lines of the research station's console displays wavered, as if viewed through heat haze, then settled back into impossible sharpness. Blake blinked, their breath catching. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, not in a malfunction, but in an unsettling, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to mirror the unseen pressure. A tremor started in Blake's spine, a brittle shiver that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. They leaned closer to the console, their fingers hovering over the emergency shutdown, but an insistent curiosity, a terrible pull, held them captive. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. The steel panels of the wall seemed to ripple, not with reflection, but with an internal, unseen motion, like water disturbed by an impossible current. The edges of Blake's vision began to fray, the periphery of the room dissolving into a swirling, indistinct haze. Blake focused on the artifact, on its unyielding blackness. It was no longer just an object, it was a focal point, a lens. And through that lens, the research station, this bastion of empirical truth, was beginning to unravel. The floor beneath their feet felt less like solid durasteel and more like a membrane, flexing with an unseen rhythm. The sounds of the station, the distant hums and clicks, became disjointed, arriving from impossible directions, echoing with a hollow, resonant quality. Then,
the static began. Not audible static, but visual. A fine, shimmering distortion overlaid everything, like an infinite number of transparent insects swarming just beyond focus. It clung to the edges of the console, the seams of the wall panels, the very air Blake breathed. They tried to rationalize it, a feedback loop, a sensory overload, but the clinical part of their mind struggled to form coherent thoughts. The revelation was not a sudden burst, but a slow, agonizing unpeeling. Blake stared, their eyes wide and unblinking. The patterns were not on the surfaces of the research station, they were in them. They were the true texture of reality, the underlying weave that the human mind, in its fragile self-preservation, had always filtered out. The walls of the research station began to bleed. Not blood, but color, impossible shades that vibrated with a silent shriek, seeping from the seams, running like liquid light down the panels. The console's display, once a crisp blue, now writhed with an internal, chaotic fire, its data lines twisting into glyphs that screamed non-meaning. Blake felt their perception stretch, thin and brittle. The horror was not an invading force from another dimension, not an alien entity. It was the fundamental, indifferent truth of existence itself, laid bare. The precise, ordered reality humans perceived was a thin veneer, a delicate illusion constructed over a churning, formless chaos that had always been there, just beneath the surface. The artifact hadn't brought the horror, it had merely removed the veil. A soundless scream tore through Blake's mind. The air tasted of ozone and something indescribably ancient, something that had no right to be perceived. The research station, once a sanctuary of knowledge, became a cage of impossible geometries and vibrating non-forms. Blake grasped the edge of the console, their knuckles white, trying to anchor themselves in a reality that was rapidly dissolving. Their own hands seemed to shimmer, their fingers appearing and disappearing in the visual static, their skin crawling with the touch of the unseen. The true nature of the cosmic horror wasn't something to be fought or understood, it was simply what was. And Blake, with their relentless determination, had finally seen it. And in seeing it, they were utterly, irrevocably undone.